The Judge's Fall. When Justice Turned Against the Innocent. Chapter 1. The arrest. The sun had just begun to climb over the rooftops of Riverton, a quiet American town where most folks still greeted each other by name. The morning air carried the familiar scent of coffee drifting from kitchen windows, the sweetness of freshly cut grass, and the faint tang of exhaust from pickup trucks rolling out for another day's work. For Daniel Harper, 32 years old and proud of the calluses on his hands, all that morning should have been like any other. A mechanic with a steady smile and a reputation for helping neighbors without charging a dime, he had no reason to expect trouble. He kissed his daughter on the forehead, gave his wife a quick, "See you tonight," and slid behind the wheel of his battered old Chevy. He had no idea it would be the last time he'd drive to work as a free man. As he turned onto Main Street, flashing red and blue lights exploded in his rearview mirror. At first, Daniel thought little of it. Maybe a broken taillight, maybe expired tags. But when he pulled over, what greeted him wasn't routine. 2 police cruisers boxed him in. 4 officers stepped out, hands resting heavy on their holsters. "Daniel Harper?" one barked. Daniel frowned. "Yes, sir. You're under arrest for aggravated assault and attempted murder." The words fell on him like a landslide. Daniel let out a short, nervous laugh. "You've got the wrong guy. I don't know what you're talking about." But the cuffs snapped tight around his wrists before he could get another word out. Curtains twitched in nearby houses. Neighbors peered through windows. Drivers slowed to gawk as the police pushed his head down and shoved him into the back of a squad car. His daughter's school bus rattled by at that exact moment. Tears burned Daniel's eyes. "What's happening? Who could ever believe I'd hurt someone?" At the station, detectives laid out a case that seemed airtight. A man had been beaten within an inch of his life outside Jefferson's bar the night before. Witnesses swore they'd seen Daniel leaving the scene. A wallet found near the victim supposedly carried Daniel's fingerprints. Daniel protested, begged, swore he'd been home. His wife and daughter could vouch for him. But his words meant nothing stacked against paperwork, sworn statements, and evidence that felt manufactured. The police didn't care. The prosecutor didn't care. And soon, Daniel would discover the judge wouldn't either. That night, locked in a holding cell colder than stone, he whispered to himself, "I didn't do this. God help me. I didn't do this." Outside those gray walls, however, a storm was already brewing, one that would pit an innocent man against a powerful judge with secrets of his own. Chapter 2. The Courtroom. Drama. The Riverton courthouse loomed like a fortress, its stone columns rising high above the townspeople who shuffled inside with hats in hand and nerves in their eyes. For Daniel Harper, walking through those doors in shackles felt like stepping into his own funeral. The polished marble floors reflected his every movement, the clinking of his chains echoing down the corridor like a cruel announcement. He is no longer a man. He is the accused. Inside the courtroom, whispers filled the air like smoke. Reporters crowded the benches, their pens ready. Residents of Riverton, some whose cars Daniel had repaired without charge, now stared at him with suspicion. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed, and then he entered, Judge Malcolm Reeves, late 60s. A jaw cut from stone, eyes that hardly seemed to blink. He carried himself with the arrogance of a man who had sat too long on the bench and forgotten that justice belonged to the people, not to him. His black robe flowed behind him like a shadow as he struck his gavel with a force that silenced the room. "Be seated," Reeves commanded. Daniel's attorney, a young public defender named Michael Grant, leaned close and whispered, "Stay calm." "Let me do the talking," but Daniel felt the air pressing down like a weight on his chest. Calm was impossible. He was terrified. The prosecutor rose first, Thomas Rayner, sharp suit, slick hair, a man with a reputation for never losing. He paced with the confidence of a predator circling prey. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Rayner began, his voice smooth and commanding. "The evidence will show that Daniel Harper brutally attacked a man outside Jefferson's bar. The victim barely survived. And while Mr. Harper may claim innocence, the fingerprints, the eyewitnesses, and the timeline all point directly to him. This man is not who he pretends to be in our community. Behind that mechanic's friendly smile lies a violent temper. Daniel wanted to leap up to scream, "That's a lie!" But Judge Reeves's cold stare froze him where he sat. When the defense's turn came, Michael rose, his papers trembling. He was young, inexperienced, and hopelessly outmatched. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice cracking, "my client is innocent. On the night in question, he was at home with his wife and daughter. They will testify to this. The prosecution's so-called evidence, objection," Rayner snapped. "Sustained," Reeves said sharply before Michael could continue. "Counselor, refrain from discrediting evidence until it has been properly introduced." The jury shifted uncomfortably. Daniel clenched his fists. Throughout the trial, every defense effort was crushed. Evidence that might help Daniel was dismissed as irrelevant. Witnesses prepared to support his alibi were not allowed to testify. Meanwhile, the prosecution's witnesses rolled in, each one welcomed without resistance. A bartender swore he saw Daniel near the scene. A police officer spoke confidently of fingerprints, and the victim himself, bandages still covering his wounds, pointed across the courtroom and said, "That's him. That's the man who attacked me." Daniel shook his head violently. "No, I wasn't there." "Order!" Reeves slammed his gavel. "Mr. Harper, another outburst and I will hold you in contempt." Silence followed. Thick, suffocating, like the walls themselves were closing in. By the end of the first day, Daniel understood something chilling. This wasn't a trial. It was an execution in disguise, and Judge Reeves wasn't interested in justice. He was interested in a guilty verdict. As bailiffs led Daniel back to his cell that night, he whispered to himself, "They've already decided. I never stood a chance." But somewhere, deep beneath the crushing despair, a flicker of hope refused to die. Maybe tomorrow, maybe somehow, maybe the truth would find a way through. What Daniel didn't know was that the man in the black robe, the man who held his fate in his hands, carried secrets that would one day bring him crashing down. Chapter 3. The Wrongful Verdict. The trial stretched on for days, each one heavier than the last. For Daniel Harper, every sunrise brought the same ritual. Shackles biting into his wrists, cold stares from the crowd, and the unblinking eyes of Judge Reeves fixed on him like a hawk circling prey. Michael tried. God, he tried. But he was drowning in a courtroom designed to sink him. He called Sarah Harper, Daniel's wife, to the stand. Her hands trembled as she swore under oath, insisting Daniel had been home. She spoke of dinner together, how Daniel tucked Emily into bed, how they watched an old movie until she fell asleep on the couch. Rayner pounced like a wolf. "Mrs. Harper," he said smoothly, circling her, "you love your husband, don't you?" "Yes," Sarah whispered. "You'd do anything to protect him, wouldn't you?" "I'm telling the truth. Even if the truth means bending facts to keep him out of prison." "Objection!" Michael shouted, but Reeves leaned forward, eyes like ice. "Overruled. The witness will answer." Sarah's lip quivered. She looked helplessly at Daniel, then whispered, "No, I wouldn't lie." But the poison was already planted. Doubt seeped into the jury like smoke. Daniel insisted on taking the stand himself, against Michael's desperate advice. "I didn't do this," he said firmly, meeting the jurors' eyes one by one. "I've never hurt anyone in my life. That man," he gestured to the victim across the courtroom, "I don't even know him. I wasn't near Jefferson's bar. I was home with my family. I'm begging you to believe me." The room hushed. For a moment, some jurors shifted as though they felt the weight of his sincerity. Then Rayner struck. "Mr. Harper, do you have any proof you were home? Any phone records? Security footage? Neighbors who saw you?" Daniel's throat tightened. "No. Just my wife and daughter." Rayner smiled coldly. "Convenient, isn't it? The only people who can back your story are the two most desperate to keep you out of prison." "Objection!" Michael tried again. "Overruled," Reeves snapped. It was a nightmare with no exit. On the final day, closing arguments sealed Daniel's fate. Rayner stood tall, voice ringing with conviction. "This case is simple. The evidence is clear. The witnesses are credible. Daniel Harper is guilty. If we let him walk free, we tell this community violence carries no consequence. Don't let sympathy cloud your judgment. Do your duty, Michael's voice wavered as he fought back. Daniel Harper is innocent. The state's evidence is circumstantial. His alibi has been silenced, ignored. If you convict him, you are condemning an innocent man, the jury filed out. Hours passed. Daniel sat hunched at the defense table, whispering prayers he wasn't sure anyone was listening to. At last, the jurors returned. Their faces were unreadable. The foreman stood. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts. The words slammed into Daniel like a hammer. His chest constricted. He couldn't breathe. Sarah's scream cut through the courtroom. Emily sobbed, clinging to her grandmother's skirt. Order! Reeves barked, gavel striking, but his eyes betrayed something more than duty. A flicker of satisfaction, as though this was the outcome he had wanted all along. Daniel Harper, Reeves declared, you are hereby sentenced to 25 years in state prison. The gavel fell. The sound echoed like a death knell. Daniel's knees buckled. Bailiffs dragged him toward the door. He turned once, locking eyes with Sarah, her face streaked with tears. I'll come home, he mouthed. I promise. But deep inside, a cold dread whispered that it was a promise he might never be able to keep. Up above, Judge Reeves adjusted his robe and moved briskly on to the next case, as though he hadn't just destroyed a man's life. What Daniel couldn't know then, what no one yet realized, and was that this verdict wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The storm that would one day bring Reeves crashing down had only just begun to gather. Chapter 4, Life Behind Bars. The heavy steel doors clanged shut behind Daniel Harper, sealing him into a world he'd never imagined. Riverton State Prison stretched like a concrete beast across the horizon, gray walls topped with barbed wire, guard towers scanning the yard below. Inside, the air was thick with sweat, smoke, and the quiet menace of men who had long since given up on freedom. Daniel shuffled forward with his new prison number stitched across his chest. Guards barked orders as if he were cattle. His shackles rattled with every step. Each clink a cruel reminder that the life he once knew, his shop, his wife's laughter, his daughter's bedtime hugs, was gone. They shoved him into a cell barely wide enough for 2 bunks and a steel toilet. His cellmate, Marcus Doyle, a wiry man with tattoos crawling up his arms, barely looked up from his book. New meat, Marcus muttered. Don't snore and we'll get along fine. Daniel sat on the bottom bunk, staring at the peeling paint on the wall. He whispered to himself, I don't belong here. But the walls didn't care. Days turned into weeks. Daniel learned the rules quickly. Keep your head down, don't look too long at anyone, and never show fear. But inside he was unraveling. Nights were the hardest. He lay awake listening to the clanging of gates, the distant shouts of inmates, and the muffled sobs of men who pretended they were made of stone. His daughter's face haunted him, her small hand pressed to the glass during visits, asking when he was coming home. Sarah came as often as she could, but the visits tore him apart. The glass divider separated them, phones pressed to their ears, their hands lined up, but never touching. You have to hold on, Sarah whispered once, her eyes red. Emily needs you. I'm trying, Daniel said, his voice breaking. But it feels like they buried me alive. Sarah's chin trembled, but her eyes burned with determination. Then I'll dig you out. I don't care how long it takes. One day Marcus broke the silence of their cell. You one of those guys who says he's innocent? Daniel nodded slowly. Marcus chuckled. Half the block says the same. Judges don't care. Once they slam that gavel, you're just a number. Daniel clenched his fists. I am innocent. Reeves knew it. He didn't care. He wanted me guilty from the start. Marcus shrugged. Then you better pray somebody out there cares enough to prove it. 'Cause in here, truth doesn't mean a damn thing. Those words lodged in Daniel's chest like a stone. He realized Marcus was right. If there was any hope, it lay outside these walls. And outside, Sarah Harper was already preparing for war. Chapter 5. The Whistleblower, Echosa. Rain came down in sheets the evening Clara Jennings decided to chase the story that would change her life. Fresh out of journalism school, Clara was stuck writing puff pieces for the Riverton Gazette, but something about the Harper case gnawed at her. Daniel's wife had stood outside the courthouse for weeks, clutching a sign that read, Free Daniel Harper. Clara had covered it once, a throwaway column buried on page 9. But Sarah's defiance haunted her. Why fight so hard if he were guilty? One night, Clara sat hunched over court records in the dim basement of the courthouse. Dust clung to her sleeves, and the hum of old fluorescent lights filled the silence. She pored over Daniel's case file, flipping page after page. Then she saw it. The forensic report, or rather, the altered version. It claimed Daniel's fingerprints were a match to the wallet at the crime scene. But tucked inside the file, nearly forgotten, was the original draft. The analyst's words were clear. Latent fingerprints inconclusive. Cannot confirm match to Harper, Clara's heart pounded. The evidence hadn't been weak. It had been buried. The next night, Clara met with an anonymous source, a former court clerk, in a shadowed diner booth. The clerk's hands shook as he sipped his coffee. "You didn't hear this from me," he whispered. "But Reeves, he's dirty. I've seen him meet with prosecutors before trials. I've seen envelopes passed under tables. If he wants someone convicted, they don't stand a chance." Clara's pen flew across her notebook. "Are you saying Harper's trial was rigged?" The clerk's eyes darted toward the door. "I'm saying it wouldn't surprise me." When Clara shared her findings with Sarah, the diner waitress collapsed into a chair, clutching the documents as though they were holy scripture. "They knew," Sarah whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "They knew he was innocent and locked him away anyway." Clara placed a steady hand over hers. "This isn't just about Daniel. This could bring Reeves down." That Sunday, Clara's article hit the stands. Suppressed evidence in Harper trial raises questions about Judge Reeves. At first, it was a ripple. Then a wave. Local TV picked it up. Radio hosts debated it. Social media lit up, and Judge Reeves, reading the headline in his chambers, felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Fear. Chapter 6. A mother's fight snow swept through Riverton that January, blanketing the courthouse steps in silence. But every morning, Sarah Harper still stood there with her sign. At first, she was alone. People hurried past, shaking their heads. Some muttered, "Give it up," or "He's guilty." But Sarah refused to move. Then Clara's article hit. And slowly, others joined her. A neighbor brought coffee. A church group lit candles at night. Soon, a small crowd gathered, their voices rising with hers. One bitter evening, Sarah addressed them, her breath forming clouds in the icy air. "My husband is innocent. He was taken from us because a courtroom cared more about convictions than truth. Reeves silenced witnesses. He buried evidence. But we won't stop fighting until Daniel is free." Someone filmed her speech on their phone. By morning, it had gone viral. Sarah Harper was no longer just a wife. She was a symbol. Inside prison, Daniel pressed his palm against the glass during visitation as Sarah leaned close. "People are listening," she whispered. "We're not alone anymore. Clara's articles are spreading. They're investigating Reeves." Daniel's throat tightened. "You're doing all this for me?" Sarah's eyes burned with fire. "For you. For Emily. For the truth." He couldn't touch her. But when their palms lined up through the glass, Daniel felt the first spark of hope he'd had in years, but Sarah knew protests and headlines weren't enough. To bring Daniel home, she needed something undeniable, and fate was about to put that weapon in her hands. Chapter 7. The Hidden Evidence. The courthouse basement was colder than usual. A maze of dust-choked shelves stacked high with cardboard boxes. Few people ever came down here. That's exactly why Clara Jennings had slipped in with a borrowed key from her source. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead as she pulled open a box marked Harper v. State. Inside, the files looked neat, almost too neat. She flipped through transcripts, motions, and evidence logs until her eyes froze on the forensics section. There it was again, the revised fingerprint report. The one claiming Daniel's prints matched the wallet, but something was off. Clara dug deeper, her hands trembling as she rifled through the bottom of the box. And then she found it. The original report, folded and nearly forgotten. Her heart pounded. The words were unmistakable. Latent fingerprints are partial and inconclusive. Cannot confirm match to Harper. It was the smoking gun. The truth Reeves had buried. Clara rushed to Sarah Harper's kitchen the next morning, papers spilling from her hands. Sarah's uniform smelled faintly of coffee from her diner shift, her face pale with exhaustion. "You need to see this," Clara said breathlessly, spreading the documents across the table. Sarah bent over them, her fingers trembling as she traced the analyst's words. Her breath hitched. They lied. They locked him away, knowing the prints didn't match. Clara nodded. Reeves let it through anyway. He silenced the truth. Sarah pressed her hand to her mouth, tears falling freely. This could free him. Clara's voice hardened. Not could. Will. When Clara's new article dropped, it hit Riverton like a lightning strike. Suppressed evidence in Harper case. Fingerprint report altered. Within hours, the story was everywhere. TV anchors debated it. Radio shows buzzed. Twitter exploded. Protesters outside the courthouse doubled in number, their chants echoing through the square. Free Harper! Investigate Reeves! Justice now! The state attorney general announced a formal review of the case. Judge Reeves sat alone in his chambers, the glow of his desk lamp casting deep shadows across his face. The bourbon in his hand did little to quiet the storm rising inside him. For decades, he had bent the law to his will. But now his name was plastered across headlines. His phone buzzed with messages from allies urging caution. Some even cutting ties. Reeves slammed his glass down, amber liquid spilling across the papers. I've survived worse, he muttered. But deep in his gut, for the first time he knew he might not survive this. At Riverton State, Daniel was summoned to the warden's office. His pulse raced. Bad news always came this way, but instead, the warden slid a folded newspaper across the desk. Daniel's hands shook as he read the headline. His chest swelled, eyes filling as he whispered aloud, "They know." For the first time since the gavel had fallen, Daniel Harper allowed himself to believe he might not die behind bars. The cracks in Reeves's fortress had begun to spread, and soon the whole structure would come crashing down. Chapter 8. National Spotlight. By February, Riverton wasn't just a town on a map anymore. It was a headline flashing across every screen in America. Satellite trucks lined the courthouse square, their dishes stabbing the winter sky. Reporters jostled for camera angles, their voices rising over the chants of protesters that filled the air. Judge Reeves accused of evidence tampering in Harper case. The story was everywhere. One night, Sarah Harper sat across from Anderson Cooper under the studio lights, her hands trembling in her lap. But when the cameras rolled, her voice was steady, almost fierce. My husband is innocent. He's been innocent since the day he was arrested. Judge Reeves buried the truth, and if it can happen to Daniel, it can happen to anyone. This isn't just about my family. It's about every family who believes in justice. The studio audience sat silent, hanging on every word. Across the country, millions of viewers leaned closer to their screens. Judge Reeves tried to fight back, granting carefully chosen interviews. These are baseless attacks, he said smoothly, his deep voice rehearsed. My rulings were firm and consistent with the law. But when clips of Reeves aired alongside Clara's documents, his own handwriting exposed, the mask cracked. He looked less like a man of law and more like a cornered politician. The protests spread beyond Riverton. In Washington, D.C., thousands marched to the steps of the Capitol with signs, "Free Daniel Harper. No judge above the law." The chants rolled like thunder. Politicians, once silent, now called for judicial oversight. Senators demanded hearings. Reeves had gone from untouchable to radioactive. In Riverton Prison, Daniel watched the coverage from the flickering TV in the common room. Other inmates slapped him on the back. "You're famous, man," one laughed. "Whole damn country knows your name." But for Daniel, it wasn't fame that mattered. It was hope. He imagined Emily's smile when she'd finally see him free. He imagined holding Sarah again without glass between them. Hope was dangerous in prison. But for the first time, it didn't feel foolish. It felt real. Back at home, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of letters from strangers across the nation. She opened one, written in shaky handwriting. I lost my brother to a wrongful conviction. Don't stop fighting. You're speaking for all of us. Sarah wiped her tears, her resolve hardening. She wasn't just fighting for Daniel anymore. She was fighting for every family broken by injustice, and for Judge Reeves, the walls were closing in. The Attorney General's investigation widened. Former defendants crawled out of the shadows, each one claiming Reeves had silenced evidence in their trials too. It was no longer a matter of if he would fall. It was only a matter of when. Chapter 9. The Battle in Court. The courthouse square looked like the front lines of a war. Camera crews battled for space, protesters pressed against barricades, and the chants of "Free Harper" thundered against the courthouse walls. Inside, the air was electric. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Some faces belonged to curious locals, others to journalists who had flown in from across the country. Everyone knew this wasn't just a retrial. It was the reckoning of a system that had nearly destroyed an innocent man. Daniel Harper walked in, wearing a plain suit Sarah had scraped together money to buy. Gone was the orange jumpsuit. For the first time in 2 years, he looked like a man again, not just a number. He glanced back at Sarah and Emily in the gallery, giving them a faint smile that trembled with both hope and fear. At the bench sat Judge Eleanor Whitaker, known statewide for her no-nonsense reputation. She raised her gavel. "This courtroom will not be a stage for politics," she said, her sharp gaze sweeping the room. "We are here to consider State vs. Harper, nothing more. Nothing less, but everyone knew she was wrong. This trial was about far more than one man. The prosecution's case prosecutor, Mark Hill, rose, his graying hair and stiff posture giving him the air of a soldier trying to defend lost ground. "The evidence against Mr. Harper was strong then," he declared, "and it remains strong now. Eyewitnesses place him at the scene. The victim himself identified him. Errors in paperwork do not erase the truth." He spoke with confidence, but the jurors shifted uneasily. The words felt hollow after weeks of headlines. The defense strikes back. Daniel's attorney, Rachel Monroe, was young but sharp, her presence commanding. She rose with a calm fire. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the prosecution has just asked you to ignore the truth. They told you Daniel Harper's fingerprints were found on the wallet. That is false. Here," she held up a sheet of paper, her hand steady, "is the original forensic report. It states clearly the prints were inconclusive." She let the words hang in the air. This report was buried, hidden, altered under Judge Reeves's approval. "This isn't a mistake. This is corruption," murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Cameras clicked. Rachel's voice sharpened. "Daniel Harper has already lost 2 years of his life to a lie. Today, you have the power to give that time back, not just to him, but to his wife, to his daughter, to the truth itself." Witness after witness, the defense called Dr. Leonard Briggs, the forensic analyst who had written the original report. "My findings were clear," Briggs testified, his voice firm. "The fingerprints were partial. They could not be confirmed as Harper's. The altered report presented in court was not mine." "It was changed. Did you authorize those changes?" Rachel asked. "Absolutely not." The jury leaned forward, eyes wide. Then came a bombshell. Clara Jennings herself was called to the stand. With a reporter's precision, she laid out the trail of evidence she had uncovered, from the buried reports to Reeves's handwritten notes. And when those notes were projected on the courtroom screen, the words leapt out in Reeves's unmistakable scrawl, "Convict Harper." Evidence revised as needed. The gallery erupted. Judge Whitaker had to pound her gavel to restore order, but the damage was done. The jury had seen the smoking gun. For Daniel, sitting at the defense table, the weight of 2 years lifted just a little. His hands trembled as he glanced back at Sarah, who clutched Emily close. For the first time, it felt real. Freedom was within reach. But Reeves wasn't done fighting. In the shadows, he was preparing a move that could either save him or destroy him completely. Chapter 10. The verdict and the fall. The courtroom was packed to suffocation. Journalists filled every bench. Protesters outside roared so loudly their voices rattled the windows. The whole country was watching Riverton. The jury filed in, their expressions grave. Daniel's pulse thundered in his ears. Sarah held Emily's hand so tightly the little girl winced. Judge Whitaker's voice cut through the silence. "Jury, have you reached a verdict?" The forewoman stood, holding a folded slip of paper. Her hands trembled, but her voice was steady. "Yes." "Your Honor, we have." The words rang out like a bell. "On the charge of armed robbery, we find the defendant, Daniel Harper, not guilty." For a moment, silence. Then the room exploded. Sarah sobbed openly, clutching Daniel as he collapsed into her arms. Emily wrapped her arms around his waist, crying, "Daddy!" over and over. Strangers in the gallery cheered. Protesters outside roared with joy. After 2 years of hell, Daniel Harper was finally free, but the story didn't end there. Days later, Reeves himself sat at the defendant's table, stripped of his robe, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. The charges: judicial misconduct, suppression of evidence, conspiracy. The Attorney General thundered before the court. For years, Judge Reeves used his bench not as a place of justice, but as a throne of corruption. He buried evidence. He destroyed lives. Today, the law he twisted finally holds him accountable. Witnesses lined up, former clerks, attorneys, even defendants, each adding another nail to Reeves's coffin. The jury didn't take long. Guilty. On all counts. Epilogue Reeves was led away in handcuffs, the same fate he had forced on countless innocents. His name became a curse in Riverton, his legacy destroyed. Clara Jennings won a Pulitzer for her reporting. Her work sparked reforms across the state, new oversight boards, and safeguards to prevent future corruption. Sarah reopened the diner, now packed with neighbors who once doubted her but now treated her like a hero. And Daniel? He rebuilt slowly. Nightmares lingered, but every morning he woke to the smell of coffee, the sound of Emily's laughter, and the warmth of Sarah's hand in his. One truth guided him now. Corruption may bury the truth for a time, but justice, no matter how long it takes, always finds its way back into the light. Epilogue: Justice finds its way. The seasons turned in Riverton, but the memory of the trial lingered like a scar across the town. Where once the courthouse had symbolized order and respect, people now looked at its stone pillars with caution, remembering how easily justice had been twisted by one man's ambition. But they also remembered something else: the sight of a wife refusing to give up, a daughter holding her father's hand again, and a community rising to confront corruption head-on. Daniel Harper returned home to a house that felt both familiar and strange. His workshop smelled of oil and rust just as he left it, though the dust on the tools told of the time stolen from him. Emily had grown taller. Sarah had grown stronger, hardened by the fight she had led. Nights were difficult at first. Daniel woke often, sweat beading on his forehead, the clang of prison gates echoing in his dreams. But each time Sarah's hand on his shoulder brought him back. Each morning, Emily's laughter chipped away at the darkness. It was slow, but life returned. Clara Jennings sat at her desk months later, a Pulitzer certificate framed on the wall behind her. But the award meant less to her than the letters that poured in, families thanking her for giving them courage, for shining a light where the system had failed. She smiled at one letter in particular, from Daniel himself. It was short, just a few lines. "You didn't just save me. You saved the truth. Thank you." And as for Judge Malcolm Reeves, his name became a cautionary tale in every law school classroom, a reminder of how power could rot a man from the inside. He lived out his days in a narrow cell, hearing the same clang of steel doors he once ordered on others. He died not as a man of honor, but as a convict, his legacy buried under the very justice he had betrayed. One quiet evening, Daniel stood on his porch watching the sunset bleed gold across the sky. Sarah leaned against him, Emily chasing fireflies in the yard. For the first time in years, he let himself breathe deeply, no walls around him, no shackles at his wrists. He whispered almost to himself, "We made it." Sarah heard and smiled softly. "No, Daniel. We fought for it." And in that moment, with the warmth of his family at his side and the world wide open again, Daniel knew the truth that would guide him for the rest of his life. Justice can be delayed. It can be twisted. It can even be buried. But in the end, it always finds its way back to the light. If you believe no judge should ever be above the law, hit like right now. Subscribe today for more powerful true crime and justice. Stories that prove truth always wins. Share this video with someone who still believes in justice. Together, we keep the fight alive. What would you have done if this happened to your family? Comment below. I want to hear your thoughts. Stay with us until the end. The final verdict will leave you speechless.